There we go. That title should have ticked most of YouTube's favorite algorithmic boxes. But in all seriousness, a more tactically sound introduction to my point would be why authoritarianism is endemic to individualism, meaning why it's a plague on all humanity, but is also completely impossible to eradicate without fundamentally lessening the human experience. And to explain why, I'm going to dig into a bag of my old tricks and pull out one that I've used several times recently, that being the dipolar relationship between the Jedi and Sith orders and their codes. Last week, when I attempted to dissect the seeming aversion to firearms in modern fantasy, I mentioned how I've come to believe that the ideological schism between the Jedi and Sith represents the real-world division between the left and right arms of our modern political factions. Although I'll freely admit up front that it's hardly a one-to-one analog, the thematic similarities I think still fit well enough for a valid comparison to be drawn. What does that have to do with authoritarianism? Well, in other videos past, I've outlined how and why authoritarian states are always unstable in the long term. The TLDR of that explanation is simply that every organism is ultimately on its own side first and foremost, and it is always necessary to succeed in the short term before any long-term advantages can be considered. Therefore, if granted power, authority, over the governing forces of their home ecosystem, an organism will naturally work to manipulate those forces for their own short-term benefit. This is why every religion works to get closer to the divine, either through the arcane crafts of magic, through channeling mediums of prayer, or through the synthetic artifices of science, technology, or political rhetoric. Why do you think everyone keeps harping on about culture and narratives? Because narratives are much easier to produce, sell, and manipulate than incentive structures, even though it is the latter which actually moves individuals. You can't force or trick people into wanting things they know don't really benefit them, but you can gaslight, brainwash, or intimidate them into sacrificing towards these contradictory agendas anyway. But this should all be fairly old and standard rhetoric to anyone who's actually had the misfortune of having to live in the real world over the last several years. So how does Star Wars fit into this model? Well, consider the dynamic, both moral and philosophical, between the Jedi and the Sith orders. What do their codes portend to offer, and how does this compare with how their respective empires actually function? Again, I've gone over this at length in other videos, but to borrow a succinct summary of the issue from the criminally undersubscribed YouTuber, Genzarai1, the Jedi are the better way to live, but the Sith are better fighters. Or, as Carthonasi from Knights of the Old Republic phrased it, I suppose that's the nature of the dark side, power but no longevity. On a 1v1 basis, the average Sith Lord utterly dominates the rank-and-file Jedi Knight, and even some of their lesser masters. However, in the long run, the instant they run out of powerful external enemies to face, the ambition and drive that promotes their power will rebound upon its source, killing the order that produced it, devouring the whole colossus from within. This is the ultimate folly of all authoritarian states, both real and fictional. Sure, they can mobilize large hordes of expendable bodies in a comparatively short amount of time, but since their direction comes from a place of personal aggrandizement rather than harmonious motion, the end result is always mass dissatisfaction, destabilization, disunification, decay, and eventually total systemic collapse. Again, I'll reiterate that I'm summarizing a whole 5 or 6 other videos I've already made covering these points in detail. If you want the fully dissected scope of what I'm on about, go check out my playlist that I've linked down in the description. But for right now, the one point I want to nail home is that the propensity of some people's ambitions to outstrip and eventually overpower everyone else's is endemic. Some people are just that single-mindedly driven, and the single greatest flaw of capitalism, that being just socio-economic Darwinism, is that just like its natural counterpart, the system itself has no inbuilt checks on this ambition, meaning that it cares not whence the money flows, just that it flows. Just like in nature, during times of plenty, the organizations which grow the largest the fastest, either through skill or through luck, or a combination, will secure all the most lucrative fonts of the environment's resources. From there, they'll begin digging their root canals, growing their canopies, and spreading their seeds so as to crowd or shade out all their smaller, more hospitable competitors. Just so, the Jedi Order is frequently shunted onto the back foot during the inaugural Sith incursion, be it an out-and-out invasion or a more subversive web of political schemes, corporate machinations, and criminal plots. Sound familiar? If you've seen my Model for a Post-Industrial World video, then you'll be just as aware of how I view the relationship between large societal collectives and more moderately scaled tribal units. In short, The latter's social tensegrity more perfectly aligns the personal and collective interests of its members, whereas the former offers a greater margin for error on account of having more that it can afford to lose before suffering loss of vital functions, similar to how a larger animal holds a combative advantage over a more diminutive opponent. Its greater bulk allows it to withstand greater abuse, while the greater mass and leverage of its arms allows for greater force production with comparable effort, proportionately speaking, obviously. Basically, by default, an elephant can hit hard enough to crush a lion with a single blow, while even a full pride of lions would not only have to get extremely lucky over and over and over again to do any decisive damage, they would have to exert far more effort and take far more tremendous risks than any amount of caloric reward could compensate for. Thus is the calculation many people, particularly the young, all around the world are finding themselves making. Hence the evolution of such social retractive movements as MGTOW, quiet quitting, lying flat, hikikomori, and so forth. Essentially, young people see little or no prospect of long-term returns for their short-term sacrifices, and therefore they commit the totality of their efforts to their short-term ideals and goals. Again, none of this should be revelatory to someone with a pattern recognition capacity exceeding that of the average nematode. But why do I say this is endemic? Put simply, in times of plenty, nature rewards persistence more than it does competence. Normal people will work exactly as long and hard as they must to achieve and sustain a comfortable lifestyle. Meanwhile, the greedy will stop at nothing to accumulate wealth. The power-hungry will work ceaselessly to acquire power. And there is no version of reality where these proto-sentient malignancies on the human condition are going to just sit quietly and let their toys get taken away. Therefore, just as with the Sith, the only winning move against an autocratic regime is to simply not play their corrupt games. Once their fires run out of room to expand, they'll burn themselves out. Unfortunately for us all, this is also why, just like how in Star Wars, it's impossible to eliminate the dark side without also destroying the concept of free will. In real life, the desire for independent volition is also irredeemably bound to the desire for power and control, which, in moderation, is not in and of itself an evil. But since those who would use power for unwholesome ends tend to be the most singularly motivated in its pursuit, progress and prosperity seem also inextricably bound to despotism and autocracy. Now, as you may have surmised from the last paragraph, this wasn't so much an intellectual thought piece as a conduit article for me to vent some impotent frustrations through. I won't squander your attention or patience on exactly why I needed such an outlet, so for right now I think that's where I'll close this particular subject. Hopefully I've managed to give you something of substance to peer over. If so, consider hitting the like and/or the subscribe button, possibly consider leaving me a tip, becoming a channel member, or checking out my books on Amazon if you feel I deserve the support and can spare the shillings. And, as usual, until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, you can never think too much, you can only think badly. Peace.